Toledo, Ohio, January 27, 1992. At midnight, a call came in to the local taxi company reporting that 3 unidentified individuals had attacked a taxi driver in the parking lot of the University of Toledo student housing. The caller also mentioned hearing gunshots. The call was redirected to the 911 rescue service, and from there, to the University of Toledo officers. 2 colleagues, Green and Jeffrey Hodge, immediately headed to the specified location. It was quiet and peaceful there, the ground covered in snow, with no signs of the crime that had occurred. Neither the taxi, nor the driver, nor the assailants were noticeable. Nevertheless, the 2 colleagues decided to look around, to walk around the entire parking area. Lighting their way with flashlights, the 2 officers turned the corner of the building and saw the body. It was a girl, lying face down in the snow. The unusual position of her body stood out. Her hands were placed neatly at her sides, palms up. People don't usually fall like that. The victim was without a coat. Her dark blue sweater pulled up, and her jeans and underwear pulled down, fully exposing the midsection of her body. And in those areas of exposed skin, bullet holes were visible. There was also a bullet wound on the back of her head. The most obvious assumption, considering the appearance of the girl's clothing, was that she had been attacked with the intent of sexual violence. The victim didn't have any documents with her, but on the same evening, her roommate reported her disappearance. The victim's name was Melissa Anne Herstrum. Melissa was a 19-year-old student at the University of Toledo, studying to become a nurse. Melissa stood out among other students. She was very beautiful, cheerful, with dark wavy hair and distinctive bright lipstick that emphasized her vivacity and zest for life. Melissa had no enemies, especially not ones who would wish her harm. She wanted to have children and believed she would be a wonderful mother. No one doubted this, knowing what a sincere and kind person she was. She had so much to offer to the world, but she was prevented from doing so in the most callous way. Meanwhile, detectives from the Toledo City Homicide Department were investigating the crime scene. Shell casings were scattered everywhere, and some bullets had passed through the victim's body and into the frozen ground, so the detectives decided to dig them up along with the soil. Interestingly, one of the casings appeared as if it had been split in half by something. Additionally, not far from the crime scene, officers found a set of keys in a trash bin, and notably, among them were keys to a Ford Taurus. Police discovered the Ford approximately a kilometer from the girl's murder site, in a parking lot. What was intriguing was that the crime scene, the trash bin where the keys were found, and the parking lot were 3 different points on the campus map, and the detectives had to connect these points into a cohesive whole. The coroner took Melissa's body to conduct an autopsy. The examination revealed that Melissa had been shot 14 times at close range with a 9mm handgun. She was shot in the back of the head, causing her to fall to the ground, with her hands likely tied behind her back. Then, the killer fired another 13 bullets, shooting her in the back and descending to her legs. It was an incredibly brutal murder, as such a number of bullets was completely excessive. The pathologist ruled out the possibility of sexual assault. There was not the slightest sign of violence. However, she was partly undressed. This means the killer either aimed to humiliate her or wanted to see the damage caused by bullets hitting her exposed body. There was no alcohol or drugs in her system. She was completely sober. Marks on her wrists indicated that at some point she was immobilized with something, resembling handcuff marks. The detectives had no choice but to ask themselves who would use handcuffs. Primarily, representatives of law enforcement, or someone pretending to be a policeman. It wouldn't be the first time a killer, pretending to be a policeman, stopped a victim's car and committed a crime. Handcuffs are a means of control, so their suspect is someone seeking complete control over their victims. The news of the murder of the student quickly spread throughout the university campus. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that shortly before the murder, an unknown individual began terrorizing one of the female dormitories. Someone opened fire in the building, firing 9 shots, which were later removed from the walls. Considering that these incidents occurred practically one after another, everyone assumed that they were connected, because such things had never happened before at the University of Toledo. Indeed, it was the first murder on campus in decades, and the students were horrified. Melissa's friends couldn't understand how this could happen, why, and who could have done it. Everyone loved her. It didn't make sense. There were 30 girls living in that dormitory, and they no longer felt safe. Someone called their parents, and they took them home. Melissa's friends were worried that they were in danger, but investigators believed that Melissa was the target because of the brutality of the crime, the 14 shots, when the killer kept shooting at a dead girl. It looked like a crime that could only happen in a fit of incredible rage. Detectives interviewed Melissa's friends about how she spent the evening of January 26th. It turned out that she met up with a friend from the university's women's club, sorority, after which she planned to return home. However, someone called her and informed her that her boyfriend, JR, was spending time with another girl. so Melissa went to the parking lot adjacent to where JR lived. From there, she would be able to see when he returned home and with whom. It was for this reason that the police's initial suspicion fell on her boyfriend. Jealousy and anger often become the motives behind many thoughtless acts, especially since the 14 bullets fired into the immobilized girl indicated the rage of the attacker. Melissa's boyfriend, JR, stated that he was indeed with another girl at his home that evening. He didn't see Melissa and had no idea that someone had informed her of his infidelity. However, things were not as simple as they seemed. Investigators found out that Melissa's personal life was more complicated than it appeared at first glance because she was hiding her new relationship from her ex-boyfriend, Kenny. Kenny was a very volatile person, the kind who gets into fights in bars, can punch a wall in anger, and yell threats in fits of rage. Naturally, the question arose of what Kenny would do if he found out about Melissa's new relationship. Thus, the police suddenly had two suspects, the unfaithful boyfriend and the aggressive ex-boyfriend. Both were invited for questioning. They answered questions candidly, sincerely wanting to help the investigation, passed polygraph tests, and had alibis, meaning neither of them had any connection to the crime. However, now that both guys had been ruled out as suspects and no new ones emerged, panic began to spread throughout the university campus. Everyone understood that it still could be a random murder, and fear gripped the University of Toledo. A pair of girls from the women's dormitory reported receiving strange, threatening calls. It was the same dormitory where the unknown assailant had fired shots. The girls were so terrified that university officers escorted them to and from their classes. Since no one suspected who the killer was or why he targeted Melissa, everyone wondered who would be next, fearing that the killer could emerge from around any corner at any moment. Despite this, everyone had to continue studying and working. The detectives, contemplating their next move, noticed similarities between Melissa's murder and recent victims of a serial killer. In Los Angeles, the killer, dubbed the Mountain Strangler by the police, had murdered 10 young women and left their bodies in the mountains along the highway. Sometimes serial killers pose as police officers because it's so easy to set up a flashing light for a car, stop the victim, abduct, and kill. However, this version seemed too far-fetched. Therefore, with no suspects and feeling the tension from the growing panic on campus, the investigators returned to square one. More precisely, it was the call to the taxi dispatch when the caller reported that robbers had attacked a taxi driver. Detectives investigating Melissa's case decided to trace the call and found out that it came from a campus service building, which was locked on weekends, meaning the caller must have had keys. What did this reveal to the investigators? It indicated that the killer had keys to the locked facility. Meanwhile, the victim's hands were likely bound with handcuffs, typically positioned behind the back as police are taught. Reluctantly, the investigators had to admit the obvious. It wasn't a serial killer posing as a police officer, but an actual police officer. Detectives decided to speak with Joseph Green and Jeffrey Hodge again, the two officers from the University of Toledo who found the body. Perhaps they had overlooked some evidence. In fact, both officers had very positive reputations. Joseph was a friendly young man who told silly jokes and was just a pleasant guy. Jeffrey Hodge was also a quiet, modest man who had recently gotten married. He loved his job, was a bit of a Boy Scout, always eager to help, and had previously worked as a 911 dispatcher. He was very eager to contribute to the investigation. Detectives decided to start by questioning Joseph Green because he was the one who found the body and wrote the report. On that day, around 7 o'clock in the evening, it was snowing heavily. The girl had left her friend's place before the snowfall, meaning when Melissa and her killer appeared at the crime scene, there was already snow, and there should have been footprints in the snow. However, according to Joseph Green's report, there were no shoe prints on the ground, only freshly fallen snow. This obvious discrepancy with the facts puzzled the detectives, because it was unclear why the police officers went to inspect the area at all, if the snow was untouched and there were no footprints leading there. Moreover, they were the ones who found Melissa's keys in the trash bin. What prompted them to look into the trash bin? There was something else that puzzled the investigators. Joseph said, "When I saw the body, I knew she was dead." The investigator was surprised and asked how that was possible. Joseph replied that his family owned a funeral business, and he had seen many dead bodies. While these weren't incriminating pieces of evidence, the combined facts urged the investigators to dig deeper. Forensic investigators examined both officers' cars who were on duty that night. They were looking for physical evidence that could tie Melissa to one of the patrol cars. They couldn't find any fingerprints, but they discovered a green wool thread that matched the girl's coat. Additionally, they found a long hair on the seat. At that time, they couldn't conduct DNA comparison on the hair, but it matched the color of the victim's hair. These were more indirect pieces of evidence, but still significant. Officer Joseph wrote a report in which inconsistencies were noted. Now, with the evidence found, the hair and thread in the patrol car, the evidence against Officer Joseph Green began to accumulate one after another like a snowball. He became the main suspect in the investigation. Detectives kept an eye on him, showing up at his house in the middle of the night to collect discarded trash, trying to find something that could link him to the crime. Ultimately, detectives decided to polygraph all officers involved in the case. Joseph Green was the first to be tested, but his test came out clean. Therefore, they had to leave him alone. The only thing that continued to bother the police was his certainty about the absence of shoe prints. Usually, when a police officer sees someone in distress, they rush to them immediately, and that's probably what Green did. So he probably wasn't certain, but insisted on the absence of shoe prints, making detectives suspect him. With Joseph Green, his partner Jeffrey Hodge arrived. Nobody suspected him, but it was decided to polygraph everyone just in case. Before Melissa's body was found, and before Jeffrey started his night shift, he watched the Super Bowl with friends, including other officers. Jeffrey, for some reason, seemed nervous, asking about ballistics, how long a body can remain under certain conditions before decomposition, what it's like to see a body, essentially asking quite strange questions. He also turned on the homeowner's radio on the police frequency. Of course, friends asked him what he was doing, to which he replied that he just wants to know what's going on before going to work. Now, at the station, waiting for the results of his partner's check, he opened up to one of the detectives and mentioned how funny it was to watch the girls from the women's dormitory running out into the street in light translucent clothing when the fire alarm went off. Such conversations were not illegal, but clearly inappropriate and unbecoming for a married officer tasked with protecting these girls, especially considering it was the same dormitory where the girls were suffering from strange calls and gunshots. Nevertheless, Jeffrey went to the polygraph examiner next. As part of the preparation, he was asked various questions, such as what he considered the best thing that happened in his life, to which he answered, working as a police officer. Jeffrey had worked as an operator for the rescue service, and had tried to get into various police departments until he was finally hired by the university. And for his graduation, his grandfather gave him a pistol. The polygraph examiner casually asked which one, and he replied, Smith & Wesson, the same type of pistol from which the fatal bullets could have been fired. The polygraph examiner tensed up but didn't show it, remembering that Jeffrey Hodgson had been at the crime scene and knew how the victim was dressed, the position of the body, and the shell casings found. The polygraph examiner had to work somewhat unusually and formulate a variety of similar questions. For example, was the victim bound with a belt, stockings, wire, tape, handcuffs? And here the polygraph showed how Jeffrey Hodgson clearly reacted to handcuffs. That was enough to cast doubt on him. The detectives asked him to show the pistol given to him by his grandfather. The man agreed and said it was in the locker at the university. But there was no weapon there, and Jeffrey claimed that someone wanted to set him up, which was strange. If someone really wanted to set him up, the gun would have been there. Instead, Jeffrey's handcuffs were confiscated. They were taken to the laboratory and examined under a microscope. Traces of copper and lead, metals associated with bullets, were found on them. Considering that one bullet had fragmented upon impact with something hard, these could well have been the handcuffs. And on their inner rim, specialists found a tiny fragment of skin. However, extracting DNA from such a tiny fragment was not easy at that time and required time. Jeffrey was arrested on February 1st, 1992, 6 days after Melissa's murder. After his arrest, it suddenly became clear that he didn't seem like a nice guy to everyone around him. Girls recounted how he would stop them on fabricated pretexts, claiming they were drunk. Anne Collins was stopped by Jeffrey almost a day before Melissa's murder. She parked her car in an almost empty parking lot, and he pulled up behind her, blocking her. She hadn't been drinking, so she didn't understand why he was asking her about it. Fortunately, the persistence of the young officer seemed strange to her, and she talked to him without getting out of the car, just opening the window slightly. Anne feared and imagined what could have happened if her boyfriend hadn't shown up, with whom they were supposed to have breakfast together. She's sure she would have been Jeffrey Hodgson's first victim. But when her boyfriend appeared, Jeffrey quickly got back into his car and just drove away. Unfortunately, the next evening, he stopped another girl, Melissa Herstrum, without any reason. The students were horrified when they learned the name of the arrested man. After all, Jeffrey had escorted them to classes when they were scared, told them he was working on the case, and everything would be fine. In other words, he presented himself as a knight in shining armor, although they were actually afraid of him. The case against Hodgson was built on circumstantial evidence until 3 weeks after his arrest, when the DNA test results came in. The fragment of skin on his handcuffs belonged to Melissa Herstrum. In 1993, 18 months after the murder, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to the murder in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole. He limited his admission to just that and claimed he didn't remember anything about the crime itself. It's unlikely that this is true. He probably remembers every little detail. But even without his confession, detectives had a version of what happened to Melissa that evening. Jeffrey Hodge patrolled the area of the college campus. It wasn't his first time stopping pretty girls. Unfortunately, Melissa was alone on the street that evening. She wasn't drunk, but she was alone. She didn't have her driver's license with her, and instead of a warning or a fine, Jeffrey Hodge forced her to get into his car and drove her to the dormitory, where she got her license. He convinced her to take off her coat and put it on the back seat of the car so he could get a better look at her body. He was supposed to take her back to her car, but during the ride, he began to harass her. Melissa didn't like it, and she probably told him that such behavior would cost him his job. Another person might have ignored this, but not Jeffrey Hodge. A man who considered being a policeman the best thing that ever happened in his life didn't see himself in any other role. He drove the girl to a remote parking lot, pulled Melissa out of the car, frightened her, handcuffed her, and led her around the corner of the building. This is where he pulled down her clothes, humiliating her, and reached a point where he was horrified by what he had done and saw the only way out for himself in murder. And he shot the girl in the back of the head. Later, he called the dispatcher so he and his partner could answer the call and find the body. After all, he knew for sure that he had left footprints in the snow and needed an explanation of how they got there. He manipulated his partner, allowing him to find the body and write the report. Jeffrey Hodge also confessed to making threatening calls and shooting at the dormitory. He did this to once again respond to the call himself and appear a hero in the eyes of others. His cruelty quickly escalated, and it all ended with him killing a person. The former police captain, who headed the homicide department in 1992, said, in his opinion, Jeff Hodge is a psychopath. It showed in how his crimes escalated. He believes if they hadn't caught him, he would have become a serial killer. He would have struck again. When he was formally dismissed in March 1992, representatives of the university found that he often stopped students, or rather female students, without informing the dispatcher. Once he called a girl's home several hours after arresting her for drunk driving. Fabricated reports of robbery and an armed man on campus, as well as violated rules by waiting for students in bars outside the campus and following them to the student village, where he stopped them on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. It is believed that he made a call about a planned bombing against the university president and started fires, committing crimes that he himself investigated. He was not charged with other offenses investigated by the University of Toledo police. The prosecutor offered him a deal because the main evidence against him was DNA. They didn't even find his personal gun from which he fired at the dormitory and at Melissa. But if today all jurors know what DNA is and that it's practically a 100% guarantee that the accused is the real killer, in those years, DNA was new, just like a smeared fingerprint. The prosecutor was afraid that Jeffrey would be acquitted. At that time in Ohio, there was also no life sentence without the possibility of parole, as there is today. Therefore, he was sentenced to a term of 33 years to life, but considering the time he had already served in prison and his exemplary behavior, his first parole hearing was held on September 21, 2021. Melissa's family, her friends, and other people associated with the case, including Anna Collin, wrote letters to the parole board objecting to his release. About 400 letters were sent in total. When Jeffrey killed Melissa, he was only 22 years old. He was still relatively young and could commit more crimes if released. Furthermore, over the years, he never once contacted Melissa's family, never apologized, never attempted to explain what happened that night. Of course, his release was denied, and the next hearing will take place in 2031. The victim's family sued the university because the university administration hired Jeffrey and overlooked the numerous offenses he committed. The university paid the family $1 million, but it didn't make things easier for them. They never heard from Jeffrey Hodge what Melissa did to deserve such a fate. Although more than 30 years have passed, Melissa's university friends have not forgotten about her. A few years ago, they raised funds to create a cozy relaxation area at the university, where students can sit, relax, and remember Melissa, who once also studied at the University of Toledo, dreaming of becoming a nurse. But this was not allowed for her by a 22-year-old policeman with too high an opinion of himself, dreaming of becoming a hero, and instead of that, killing a girl whom he pledged to protect.